Now, envoys from some of the world's richest nations met with South African cabinet ministers this week to discuss a climate deal that could channel nearly $5 billion towards ending the country's dependence on coal. The discussions with South Africa included representatives from the United States, the UK, Germany, France and the EU. The delegation was led by the UK's COP26 envoy, John Murton. South Africa uses coal to generate over 80% of the power that is consumed there, making it one of the world's top 20 carbon dioxide emitters. It's actually ranked 12th worldwide. Eskom, the state energy provider, has pitched a $10 billion plan to global lenders to advance efforts to shut down the majority of its coal-fired power plants by 2050 and turn to cleaner, less polluting energy sources. All right, then, so let's explore the finer details of this proposal, as it were. John Yarwich is the Chief Executive Officer of the National Business Initiative, and she joins us now live from Johannesburg. Thank you for your time this evening. So, developed economies pledged to mobilize at least $100 billion a year when we had the Paris Climate Agreement agreed to in order to fund climate adaptation efforts in developing economies. But that target hasn't been met yet. So, should we take this off of talks seriously?
Okay, you're quite right. The commitment that was made to, it's mobilizing $100 billion by 2020 and then $100 billion annually after that is in fact what the commitment made was. And you're right, it hasn't been reached internationally. And I think the question is, will anything approaching the quantum of funding be reached? The Conference of the Parties, the climate change negotiations that will happen in Glasgow at the end of this year are seen very much as a finance COP, a place where the details and the pledges and the commitments around that financing will be center on the agenda. And I think it's in that context and in the context of an increasing understanding of the need to decarbonize globally at a much more rapid rate than we ever thought was needed some years ago, that the plan that Eskom is putting forward, Eskom's Just Energy Transaction comes into the equation. And I think it's important to understand that that commitment was by developed countries in order to support the developing world to both decarbonize and to adapt to the impacts of climate change.
So Eskom, of course, is a main source of South Africa's greenhouse gas emissions, accounting for at least 40% of it, based on the last data sets I looked at. But Eskom being what it is, being the singular provider of energy, and a bunch of that is basically based on coal, how long and how much money would it take to actually decarbonize the entire generation mix?
Okay, so if you're looking at decarbonizing, remember, you're looking at two things. You're looking at decarbonizing our generation mix as it is at this point in time. And then you're also looking to growth. So you're not only looking to decarbonize our existing power system, but you're looking for growth in the system in order to support growth in the economy. So you are looking at very large numbers. You are looking at doubling, possibly tripling the grid. You're looking, in addition to that, at as you move into a 2030s and 2040s, because remember, we're looking at a 30-year timescale. So in that 30 years, you're looking at decarbonizing the grid. You're looking at introducing significant renewables. You're looking at strengthening the grid. So there needs to be investment in grid infrastructure. You're looking in the shorter term of that period at also the need for some level of peaking support or some form of power that will support intermittency, so possibly gas as a transition fuel. And then you're looking towards certainly the 2040s, and as you get towards 2050, you're looking towards the introduction of new technologies and possibly technologies we don't even know about today, and on the basis that those will become cheaper over time. So you're looking at a very thoroughgoing decarbonization of the grid that has multiple dependencies and possibilities. And I think that for a country like South Africa, the question of how that can then be used to create new industries, new value chains, new commodities, as well as new forms of delivering power becomes really important.
And we'll get to the new commodities in a bit, but just looking at the sort of proposals on the table, I mean, Eskom is saying we can do this, we can essentially reduce the amount of coal we have in the grid by 2050. That's 30 years away, and that seems like 30 years too long. Is it possible to do it in a much shorter time?
Well, I think the essence of the Eskom proposal is that there is already a decommissioning schedule set out in the country's integrated resource plan. And central to the Eskom proposal is that the decommissioning schedule is brought forward, and that decarbonization on decommissioning of those power stations that are set to be decommissioned between now and 2050 is brought forward. And essentially what that does is to reduce emissions right across not only the Eskom emissions, but emissions right across the economy significantly. So yes, it's about an accelerated decommissioning of coal infrastructure.
Okay, so the country is also aiming to cut carbon emissions to what, 510 metric tons a year by 2025, which is really pretty close. That's roughly the same as emissions in 2017, though. Even taking that target at face value, how would that emissions reduction target be achieved?
Okay, and the emissions reduction target is even more ambitious. South Africa has just committed its latest has just submitted its latest nationally determined contribution to the UNFCCC, and in that one is looking at a range by 2030 of between it's up to 420 at the top end of the range and 350 at the lower end of the range. So it's quite a significantly more ambitious commitment that the country is making. Part of it is this transformation of the energy sector, but there are also obviously other sectors that will need to be decarbonized rapidly. And so, for example, you're looking at Sasol as a major point source of carbon emissions, looking at firstly using gas to power its operations in a very significant way. So cutting coal in huge quantities out of its processes, moving to gas in the short run, but then also investing extremely in very high levels of renewables. So I think that right across South African industry, there's a major conversation that is going on at the moment that is looking at what are the pathways to 2050 that would decarbonize our economy and get it towards net zero. And the NBI, my organization, together with Business Unity South Africa and others, has been doing extensive work on this, trying to define those pathways sector by economic sector. Green hydrogen comes into the equation. We think there's a huge potential around that. Eskom's plan and huge investment in renewables is central to it.
All right, and that actually brings me to my last question, because export hydrogen, green hydrogen, these were terms that were used in the statement that came out after the meeting between the Department of Energy and, of course, these envoys. So how exactly would this hydrogen export industry work?
Okay, so I think that worldwide there is growing interest and investment in green hydrogen. There are pilot projects right across the world. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Chile, Australia are investing in looking at developing green hydrogen economies. Given our wind and solar in this country and our renewables potential, we are ideally placed, in addition to the fact that through the Sasol Fischer-Tropsch process, we have extensive technological expertise and experience in the kinds of processes that are necessary in order to produce green hydrogen. And also in a South African context, there are other opportunities. There's opportunities for looking at green ammonia, various other forms of green chemicals, looking at green aviation fuels are all potentials that we could be looking at. And certainly what is happening is that in the developed world, in parts of the world where you don't have the kind of wind and solar that we do in the southern hemisphere, there's beginning to be partnerships formed in order to say, well, where could the sources of green hydrogen come from, and how could the kinds of trade relationships be established that would enable that to become in the long run an important export. So that's the opportunity that South Africa is looking at.
Indeed, pretty interesting stuff. We'll see how this plays out. John Yowich, the Chief Executive of the National Business Initiative, joining us there from Johannesburg.